So we'll continue our discussion. We have 4 very willing participants here. We have Casey Dixon, Todd Barry, Dylan Gaffney, and Roxanne Tisch. Thank you.
Hi folks, I'm going to stay seated, I think. It's a little more relaxing. And I want to just briefly introduce myself. I've been teaching a variety of psychology classes for 20 years, both here and at the university level. And over the course of that time, I've turned some theory into practice in the classroom. I do want to take a quick pause to say how impressed I was with students who just shared their stories, and key into what Samantha said when her father told her that everyone gets depressed. And I also believe that sometimes students don't realize that teachers can be anxious and depressed as well, right? So to that end, recognizing that is a big piece, but I also pull from Dr. Dan Siegel's work on adolescence, but I think it applies to students and adults and everybody, which is to frame a community of learners with first the understanding of them being seen, to be safe, and to be soothed. And I carry that with me when I create what I hope to be a safe environment. First, to be seen, to be validated, to be seen not just as a student, but as a full individual. Often, so many of our students are full-blown, full-cooked adults, some with children, some with families, some with a full life that they enter into our classrooms. And to be safe, to say, when I see you, you're safe, and we are a community together that we're building and sharing 15 weeks together. And finally, to be soothed, because in the educational process, at least I find, the anxiety of dealing not only with life issues, but the anxiety of grades, that stress to make that grade. And that is a torturous place to be, as you have all had your education and have known. And you can lose, in my experience, the whole educational experience in that stress. So that's one piece I try to mitigate as much as possible, so they can stay and see the forest instead of getting so stuck on the trees. And the other piece that I always try to remember when I enter into building a community for 15 weeks is the study that Rosenthal did in Harvard on the Pygmalion effect. And within that, he found that teachers often have preconceived notions of what and who their students are, and then that plays out into a reality, that reciprocal determinism sort of deal. So you get what you expect to get. So I try always to level the playing field in my mind on that, and to keep those thoughts away from me. And when the students, at least I hope I make this happen for them, when they are seen and safe and soothed, then they can relax, and if they are having mental health issues, they can come to the fore a little bit better, a little more, they're more accessible, they feel they can come to you. That said, and I appreciate the professor who spoke up at the end, our first job is to facilitate the learning of the material. That's our number one job. And the second hat that we have to wear, sadly, in this environment where everyone is stressed, is to be aware of the mental health issues as well. Yeah? And if we're not capable of handling that, making those resources obviously available is wonderful. As I said, and I'll wrap up, but yes, I have been teaching for 20 years, and the first year I taught, I got a real wake-up call about some issues that manifest with a 3 a.m. call from a student before cell phones from a bar. Something I had said or done in lecture had rattled that student in some way, so it hit some chord, and that was a, whoa, better be aware as much as I can on that. And the other little personal issue I've had with students, and I have to say, one other thing I have to say is anxiety and depression manifest, but the label mental health is a very broad umbrella. And that goes back to that big million effect. It can manifest in so many different ways. So when students are safe and seen and soothed, mania comes up, and that's easy to spot. It also can be just over anxious. And then depression can be easy. But also if we label everything as a mental health issue and we're expecting to see mental health issues, we might misunderstand what is actually going on. And so that leads me to the last little piece on a personal reflection of one particular student I remember here who had severe depression, what I thought was severe depression. Turns out he was going through a heroin withdrawal. And I was so impressed by this young man because he was so darn smart. And he felt comfortable enough to come up to me, finding out that he was in treatment, and that he was strong, and that he was going to make it through. And I, in turn, validated that and worked with him. And he ended up with an A-, and he's off to university. And I just want to say how impressed I was, because if I simply saw it as, well, the student is depressed, or the student is being oppositionally defiant, or is bored, or is putting on some, behavioral thing that sometimes we find. No, he was pulling himself out of a very dark hole. So once again, I just have to say how impressed I am with the students and the teachers here, and the whole school in general, the whole college in general, is a really warm, great place to be, and I'm honored to be a part of it. So that's all I really have to say.
Good morning. Normally when I have one of these, it's because I'm at a club and I'm ready to sing with the band, and this is not at all what's happening right now. So I'm in a little different position than many of you. I don't actually teach at the college. I am the Transitional Strategies Coordinator, so I run that program, and I serve as the dedicated advisor for all of the students who take transitional courses per semester. So the idea is that while they're in transitional, I'm their advisor, and then as they roll into their academic program, they get another advisor, and it doesn't always work that way. I develop a pretty strong relationship with my students, and many of them stay for a very long time. I try to, I guess the biggest thing that I see with students, and the thing that has helped me the most, is that I come at this from a couple of different angles. Number one, I was a classroom instructor for 10 years at the high school level, and then I did homebound instruction for students who could not attend their schools. Most of them were expelled. I did that for 5 years. But I also have a son who is on the autism spectrum. So I have worked with my local school district to come up with some programming for him. So you'll notice I was pretty close with Amanda. We worked together the other day. She came up with the list, and I spent about 45 minutes with her coming up with a list, providing her lots of encouragement and empathy and support. And she really struggled this morning. This was really, really hard for her. And I'm so darn proud of her.
Yes.
But when she went to the corner, I just gave her a minute, and then we went to the hallway, and 2 of her professors came out. These are people that she has mentioned to me as her advisor that she had a good relationship with, and they came out and provided support. She was back in here within 5 minutes because of you. So it's having a little empathy, having compassion, demonstrating kindness and patience. And you get a whole lot further with students if you can just take a breath and take a minute. And I agree that we're not always the, we don't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. But, if a student comes in and they're in crisis and I have no idea what to do, I call Matt or I call Christine. I walk them down to A-Wing, and just walking a student, the students have said that, walking them, going with them. The other day was the start of new classes. So the experience that I had is it's the start of new classes. Our wing is chaos. There are students in and out all the time. But I have a student with self-disclosed anxiety, because most of my students do self-disclose. And a lot of them do have anxiety. This is a really big transition time. But she was coming into some new classes, and she was really, really nervous. So we took a few minutes, we did a couple breathing exercises, and then I asked her, do you know where your classrooms are? No. So we got up and we went for a walk, so that when she was ready to go to class that morning, she knew where the rooms were. She knew that if she got there a couple minutes early, she could find a seat that she would be comfortable. So it's little things: empathy, patience, kindness, compassion. So, thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm Roxanne Tisch, and I'm going to build off of Tracy's point, because when I got an email from Jen asking me to be up here, I said, well, are you sure you have the right person? Because I know nothing about this. I don't feel qualified to be on this panel. But she assured me that, yes, she did mean this Roxanne. And part of it is just because of compassion, empathy, and really getting to know students to know if there might be a problem. So for example, especially with my lower level classes, I have them write a little math autobiography for me, and many of them are very, very honest and explicit about what has happened in their background as a math student, not necessarily in life, but as a math student, and sometimes in life and as a learner. And it really does help me start to get to know the student. And it gives me a kind of a leaping off point so that throughout the semester, when I interact with them and I talk with them, I can get a big picture in my head, and I can also look for patterns. I can see, okay, this person, they started out the semester looking really put together, and mid-semester they're looking a bit unkempt. Something is going on, and it just gives me an opportunity and a basis for talking to them. Todd here and I were involved in a situation with a student a couple semesters ago, so I think I might have thrown Todd under the bus a little. I made sure Jen was next to ask him to be up here. Sorry. I had a student in a class, and I could see that he really wasn't understanding the material well. So rather than calling him out in class, we walked down the hall after class one day, just chatting about his math class, what other classes he was in, how things were going. And we went to my office, and after a little more discussion, he was obviously in a full-blown panic attack. And I was like, okay, this is out of my comfort zone. Don't know what to do with this. So I said, well, let's go for a walk. And we started our way down to the A-Wing. But on the way, I had to pass Todd's office. And the student had mentioned Todd as one of his professors. So I popped in with the student to Todd's office, and he was welcoming. We had a meeting there for probably 5 or 10 minutes. And then all of us proceeded down to Matt Liscombe's office, and then Matt there for another 5 or 10 minutes. And this student is actually reminiscent of the person in the video, the bridge story, because this student in his panic attack, he was ready to drop all of his classes, drop out of school. He was just we knew it was more than we were capable of dealing with as teachers, so we made sure we found the right resource for this student.
Right, and that was a very interesting experience because when Roxanne, myself, and Matt were in that room, the masks kind of came off and we were pretty real with the student. I mean, we try to have boundaries and that's important, but it was pretty clear that he was ready to drop out of college. And then, we wouldn't be able to help him, And so I always find that when I can identify the students that are struggling, I have an unwritten rule that for those students that I think are having these sorts of struggles, an unwritten rule that there's sort of a mental health emergency in which that I'm more flexible with stuff in the syllabus. So for example, there was a due date coming up for that particular student, and I just said, don't worry about the due date. The due date is, let's not even have one right now. And that was the rule. And he wasn't able to recover ultimately in the class. He wasn't able to catch up, and he ended up withdrawing. But he withdrew. He didn't just drop out and never come back. So that was important. But at some point, we have a moral responsibility to our students to keep them safe. A lot of them are in a very precarious position in their lives, and sometimes it's a matter of physical safety. And I was concerned about that student. A couple things that I've been thinking about. One is just the relationship with the A-wing people. For example, Matt, he's my go-to counselor in terms of walking students down. I've been in his office many times over the years. And what I've learned over the years is that there's always a difference between my perception of what's going on with the student and the actual reality, and I think some people have mentioned that. So for example, I had a student last spring in my English 101 class who was so disruptive. I mean, so disruptive. Wouldn't stop moving, was not looking at the front of the room. I mean, was all over the place leaving, and I was dreading going to class. It was, it was awful, and I was making judgments about that student. Immature, disrespectful, why can't she just have respect, and this and that. I'm like, what am I gonna do? And it was threatening to disrupt my entire class, and I really resented her, because of that, and I didn't know how to handle it. And so I found myself in Matt's office one day saying, what do I do with this student, And he gave me some pointers, and I was starting to implement them. But the fact is, actually what turned the tide is, I was going around giving feedback to people on their drafts, and I remember, and people, they were working, and I was going around, and I saw her working, and at first I thought, I don't want to go in. I don't want to consult her because I was afraid that we were going to have an unpleasant social interaction. But I said, no, approach her, and I did, and we had a nice chat, and she disclosed to me in the conversation, vaguely but pointedly, that she was a victim of trauma, and I didn't ask for details, but suddenly I looked at her in a different way, and suddenly I thought, she's not a problem student, she's not disrespectful, she's been through something, and I don't know what it is, and it's really not my business, but I looked at her differently for the rest of the semester, and we started to form a bond, and I think that's important, if you can check in with a student at some point and form some kind of connection, and that's hard because emotional investment is taxing. If I have over 100 students, maybe you form closer relationships with half of them, but maybe you can form these kind of closer relationships with only a fraction of that. But I tried to, and I think it made all the difference. And so, down the road in the semester, she kept missing due dates, and I had given her an extension at one point, and she kept kind of missing them. And then finally, because we had that trust, I was able to say, no, I'm not going to give you an extension this time. And then, ultimately she withdrew. But by the end of the semester, she went and tried to get accommodations, and she was working towards that. But for me, the discrepancy between perception and reality is huge. Normally, what I'm thinking about what a student's going through is completely different from the reality. Another thing I just want to say is high academic achievers, I think, are very susceptible to these issues. I had a student a few years back who had a PTSD attack in my office, and about a due date coming up, and I walked her down to A-Wing, and we had a good chat, etc. She ended up being one of the highest academic performers in her class in a very public way, if you know what I mean, right? We have those high academic honors at the end of a year, and so she ended up being a great academic achiever. But there was that moment where, you know, gosh, if this doesn't go well, maybe she won't pass my class. Maybe she'll drop out of school. And then she ended up getting, you know, one of those highest academic honors you can get, and it was great to see her get that accolade.
Are there any questions, building off of some of the techniques that you've used or want to share?
Sorry, I have an observation. Your success stories are more about preserving the person as a student and not as much whether they pass the class or not. And sometimes not passing is a good thing, because then they can start again and do a better job. They can, I don't know. So just getting them through is not the point. It's being kind, and sometimes being kind manifests itself as failing the course, and sometimes it manifests as passing.
Well, and I think it's important that we see the student as a person, not just as a student, because yes, our content is important, but in the bigger picture, validating that student as a person and success in their life, I think that's the bigger picture.
So it's like two separate things, like their behavior as a student, and then their other issues.
I just want to add that in my experience, when you do validate a student and see them as a person and all the wonderful things we've been talking about, often that translates into academic success.
I just want to thank you guys for bringing this topic up. It's something that is rarely discussed at the college, so it takes a lot of courage to do it, so thank you to CFT. I just want to say, as someone who works in the public schools and is now involved in a disability grant with UConn, last week we had a legislative breakfast and the Norwich Public Schools superintendent was here. Their programs right now, their preschool program of over 350 kids, has 50% of their students as identified special ed, and that does not address ESL students as well. These kids grow up and they end up coming to Three Rivers, so the number of kids that you see in your classroom that are Asperger's, etc. Everyone sitting here has talked about Matt Liscombe going to, down to Wing A. We do not have the appropriate services. The numbers are insane that are coming our way, the wave of it. And to expect one person and a part-time person to be doing what you're doing, I just hope that through the work that's done today, that the college takes a much more serious look at inclusion, what we have coming. Our student handbook literally writes, we refer to the federal guidelines, what we're required to do, but then we write, we don't have a special ed program. I know we don't have a special ed program, but we have to service by law kids until they're age 21. So I just hope that the president, the dean, that CFT, that we take this and we really roll up our sleeves and get to work, because Matt, you're awesome, but you're one person.
Yeah, Sheila, you are spot on. In transitional strategies, what I find is the students I deal with have the added burden, besides any mental health challenges, they have the added burden of being academically underprepared. So they're already, I have found, and this is, anecdotal, I have no data to support this, but I have found that many of them have come out of special ed programs in public schools. They have had tons of support, K through 12, and then all of a sudden they get here and there's nothing. They don't know what to do. They don't know what they're doing here. They're not even sure sometimes why they're here. And I see more and more, I'm seeing students on the spectrum, many who disclose, many who don't. Again, having a son with spectrum disorder, it's, I can see it. But yeah, I think we have to do a better job of providing supports for these students where we can.
And I would also add not only supports for the students, but more workshops for the faculty, including the adjuncts, I had an experience last semester where I allowed a student to take a final exam with me rather than scheduling in the testing center. And this was really validating the student as a person, not because I thought she would pass the class or get a good grade, but the student really had a lot of challenges in her life, and to send her home to plan a time to go to the testing center to take a test really didn't seem appropriate. So I allowed this student to take a test with me. She had her child with her, so I hung out with the cute little kid for a while. It works for both of us. I got an email the next day from a faculty member, and it said, "You wasted your kindness on this person."
Wow.
And I just had to close the email and walk away because I was completely horrified that one of my colleagues would write that. It's not about wasting kindness on people. That's really what we're here for.
I would just say that, say I have roughly 100 students a semester, I'd say 15 of them are in full-blown crisis mode right now. And how is it going to manifest itself in my class? And every semester, I have a few students that I'm very concerned about. I mean, is it going to result in self-harm, or what? It might just be something, not as serious like failing the class or withdrawing or et cetera. And I know that the video said there's not a link, a big link between violence or this and that. But in terms of social emotional challenges, I mean, every semester or two, I have a student that, I'm concerned that if things don't go the right way in class, there might be some sort of physical aggression, and I don't have the training for that, and I'm not sure we have the support I'm not sure we know what to do in that situation, so, not to throw that out there, but I just did.
Hi, I don't want to negate Sheila's point that we do need more help to deal with our students with mental illnesses. That's true, and I am also a Matt Liscombe fan. I just want to let you know we have 3 other counselors, so when he is busy, Kathleen Gray, Deirdre Sebastian, and Meg Wixer are also counselors, and they do a great job with students as well.
That is actually the last, not that I'm ending this, I'm just to say to that point, that's the last forum that we're having after lunches. What are the resources? What are the steps? What are some additional things? So you're going to walk away with some additional materials, but you've been very
Going back to academic success doesn't necessarily mean good grades. I personally went through that. I failed both of my first semesters with 4 classes, and then failed 2 classes over at Avery Point. But I'm still here, and I'm doing well now, and it really does push to that letter grade means nothing. It really is, did you get the information and things like that. So passing that among your students is something that I really like. Professor Armenta does it all the time. He's like, don't come at me about your grades.
I had a comment as well. So.
I just had a quick, going back a little bit, I just wanted to share that.
Well, we had a.
I thought I could talk about this. Oh, well, it's not. I just wanted to share that in my experience, and I think all of ours, there are numbers of adult students who we see who never got the diagnosis of, or the testing, I don't want to say diagnosis, the testing that they've, gotten through K through 12 and beyond, but they do have, dyscalculia or some kind of significant learning challenges. And so a lot of times, that's something else that we find ourselves dealing with. And in my experience with 2 students I can think of, they have gone ahead, we've been able to refer them to get that testing, and it has made all the difference. And they've been able to graduate and finish their studies. So I'm just sending that out there because it doesn't always get caught in K through 12. And so I think that's just really important to keep in mind as well. Thank you. Where'd you go?
I just wanted to say that I had a fairly long meeting with Senator Beth Bayh, who wrote the PA 1240 legislation, and for those of you who don't know, that legislation made us have to consolidate all of our remediation to one semester of instruction. And when the legislation happened, it sort of put us in chaos, but one of the positive things that came out was that there was funding for embedded tutors in both the math and English classes. And aside from building community in the classroom, and aside from having some of the CFT events where faculty have come visit my classes, etc., I found that having embedded tutors really helps with the mental health piece, because it's another person that the students can talk to when they don't feel comfortable talking to the faculty members. However, the funds are allocated in interesting ways across the state for this program. So for example, this semester I think there are 8 English 096 classes, and we only have funds for a tutor in my classes, and in only 2 of those classes, 1 day a week. But when I spoke with the senator, she said that that was not the vision at all. The vision was to have embedded help in every one of these developmental courses. And so I would just like to also, like Sheila was saying, talk about resources and how we're allocating things and what some of the benefits are outside of just the academic piece, because I can't tell you how many times I've had tutors tell me information that students said that they wanted the tutor to tell me because they didn't feel comfortable telling the professor, and then that led to really good discussions, and it led to collaborative opportunities, and it led to further discussions with folks in the A wing who were all wonderful as well. So I think this really warrants a deeper conversation about resources in general.
Which is our last forum.
Right.
Yeah.
She mentioned something about having tutors in the classroom. I am a MacLab tutor, so I deal with students personally too. And there are so many students that I deal with that are in full-blown panic mode week 1, as Professor Barrett was saying. And so there's a lot of students that I have to like help out of that panic and kind of be like, hey, it's okay, we got this. So I think having tutors, especially in like English and math classes, would be super helpful when that happens.
So questions back about classroom interactions, office interactions, hallway interactions? Things that you've done that have been successful. Anybody want to share? Well, while you're thinking about it, I want to recognize that the 4 individuals up were not picked arbitrarily. I will say that that's what Roxanne was alluding to. They were actually come from discussions from colleagues and from actual students where discussion said this is an instructor and an individual. There were many named already today that aren't up on the panel, so I think that we know that we are trying to make these great advances, but I wanted to just recognize that our students, our participants in all of the forums were not just arbitrarily picked, they were picked for the successes that they have. But we also know that there are some challenges. So I'm hoping others of you that aren't standing up there will share.
Can I just ask the math tutor who's taking a picture right now? You mentioned that so many of you, the students that you're tutoring right now, first week, are coming in with full-blown panic attacks, you said. What do you attribute those full-blown panic attacks to? Do you know, if you have a blanket statement for that, I'd be curious.
I think a lot of time they're not used to being in school yet, especially at the beginning of the semester, or it's just because we kind of bombard students with a ton of information the first day of class, and so a lot of times they're like, well, I have to get this, this, and this, and this, and this done, and I'm like, no, you have to do these 3 things, and one of them's due this day. So they tend to look at things very full picture. They're like, because syllabuses are daunting, so it's kind of interesting to see how they take it. Some students are like, okay, so I have to get like this done. Other students are like, I have so much work to do, and they're already thinking of their final projects and things like that.
I'm going to build off that. So one of the things that I actually have, do in my class is, yes, we have the syllabus. We give them the course descriptions, course outcomes, objectives, our policies. And one of the things that I do in my class is to give the initial buy-in. Why are you here? Because sometimes you're sitting here, as you said, Tracy said sometimes they have no idea why they're here. So I actually use that as a tool. Let's look at the course objectives and outcomes, talk about it. Instead of it being just a document, it becomes that buy-in. So in other words, and then we look at it. what are the top objectives? So we identify as a group, what is it that we want to focus on as we're moving forward? So it becomes not just me standing there teaching, it becomes a whole classroom of learners. And I find that that was really successful. I had a student that said to me on my second day, she said, you know, at least it was fun in your class. It wasn't just a handout of a, this is the book you need to get, this is what I'm expecting from you kind of thing. It really gets that classroom buy-in, and I think that's something that I've done that's been successful.
I think Todd had brought up the idea about the perceptions we have of our students, and I kind of want to reverse that because Jen kind of alluded to this too with the tutor in the classroom. We're pretty intimidating. Dr. so-and-so, Professor so-and-so. And so I think if you can find ways to help students recognize that you didn't always have it together, that you weren't born with patches on your elbows and a brandy sniffer next to you while you're sitting in your velvet lounge jacket, it can go a long way. Because, you know, a lot of times our students come to us and they see us in the front of the room at least the first day or so, and they are questioning whether or not they're in the right place. Because we're there, we're the ones kind of facilitating their transition in. And so ways to make yourself more approachable, or letting them know that you didn't always have your act together, that you went through some of the feelings maybe they're going through, particularly in the early part of the semester where they're getting this dump of information, it can go a long way.
Very first day, actually, Professor Delaney, I walked in the room and I was immediately terrified. I was like, oh no. History class, oh no. And the second he made a joke, I was like, okay, this is fine.
I can actually speak to this very personally. This semester, like the week, maybe the 2 weeks leading up to the beginning of this semester, I was freaking out. And I knew in my head everything was okay. I knew 2 of the 3 professors that I've got this semester, be it inside class or outside. I knew that, like, this is my last semester here. I'm graduating with my graphic design degree in May. Yeah, I might pass all my classes. But because of my anxiety, because of the actual illness itself, because of how it affects me and my mind and my body, I was freaking out and physically feeling the effects of the anxiety, even though I knew I would be perfectly fine. So that's probably one of the issues that students that you've got who seem like they're freaking out first day or whatever, that may be something that's the issue, is that their body is telling them, holy crap, something is wrong, something is wrong, something is wrong, you better watch out, what's going on, you're in danger, what the crap. But they have to get used to the learning process again, especially after like winter break, summer break. They have to get back into the flow and just give them a chance to get back into the swing. And yeah, like Z said, crack a joke, make yourself personable so that they can relax around you and try to tell their bodies to stop freaking out. Because they really don't have to. You guys are all great.
Well, one of the things, because a lot of the stress that's on students, in my opinion, is not because of us, but oftentimes expectations of their friends and their parents. We're technology instructors sitting here. One of the reasons that Chris asked the question the way he did is because we like to solve problems. My wife has educated me over a number of years saying, all I want you to do is listen. Don't go into that engineering mode where you solve the problem. One of the things I do outside of here is I counsel families for my alma mater. Every student that applies to my alma mater gets assigned an advisor, and we're supposed to go talk to them about what a support system means, because the college is 300 miles away, and ask the parents what they're going to do the first time Joe or Jill comes home or calls and says, I got a D, I got an F. What do the parents do? Every year I have students who ask me, at least one, can you call my mom or dad and tell them I'm not supposed to be an engineer, I want to be a history teacher? And so I say, go sign the FERPA form and I'll call them. And I've had those conversations. I had a conversation this past intercession with a woman who wanted her son to get a job in technology because that's where the money is. I personally think he is failing classes so he will not have to be an engineer. So I don't know if we can have a workshop for parents to have some ideas about how they can support their kids. Because I think a lot of it is the stress that the families are putting on these kids. Oh, you're good in math, go be an engineer. That doesn't always work, so just a suggestion.
I think Meg would say
Well,
something though.
Can I add something to this? I know it's a hard thing to accept, but we cannot be problem solvers. Unfortunately, I have had too much experience recently in the outside world with people with mental health issues, addiction disorders, and just, I can be there, I can be supportive, I can direct to resources, but I can't solve the problem. And I think that knowing that I can't be the solution, I can listen, I can be compassionate, I can be empathetic, but that's really all that I can do.
Another thing is, we've talked a lot about the relationship between the teacher and the student, and then it's interesting you bring up the families. Another thing that we need to do is facilitate relationships between the student and other students in the class, and that's scary because you're not in control of what they're all doing. And I find that this comes up with issues of small group work and small group projects, and over the years I've learned to become flexible. When things don't work out, what are my go-to choices? Okay, so, you know, X student isn't working well with the others because of whatever issues. Well, what are the other options available that I will give to the student as a form of accommodation informally? Oh, well, you could do X or Y, which is great, although I had learned an interesting lesson last semester when this happened. I had a student who was having some emotional, social issues. Again, we don't know what it is. I didn't have any documentation. I didn't disclose anything, but he was having issues. And so he was working on a project with his group, and then the group members came to me and they said, he's really, being disruptive and not helping, and he doesn't want to be part of it and this and that. And so I went to him and I said, well, here's your option. You can do it on your own or write this or whatever. And again, perception versus reality. He was so taken aback. He was so shocked. He didn't know his behavior was alienating his group members. He didn't know that the way he was behaving was causing them to say, wow, we don't want you in our group. I mean, it was that level of whatever. And so I took this as an opportunity to take a risk, and the next class period, I tried to facilitate a conversation between the student and the other group members in the class, and they all were able to kind of come to an agreement. And then when it came time for them to do a presentation, it was clear that he was suffering from some sort of anxiety or whatever, and he, as he was speaking, was kind of saying some inappropriate things or things that were kind of out of context. But then not only were his group members, but the rest of the students in the class started rooting him on. Kind of like what we saw today here, with one of the students who was experiencing some anxiety. And so when you can get other students in the class trying to help the student in distress, that's awesome.
So Jen asked me to just say a couple quick things. One is that, and we probably know this, but about 50% of our students are first generation. So many of them are coming in and they have those expectations of, a lot of times they're looking for what is the way that I can get a living wage job, a decent, an education that's going to allow me to have, a decent life. But oftentimes they don't know all of those possibilities. And one of the things that I think many of us do on a regular basis is when students come in to see us for advising or whatever might be going on, or let's say they're having trouble with probation or suspension, is to ask them, is this the major that you feel is the right one for you? And a lot of times students are still not sure, and they do need help understanding what are the possibilities and helping them make the connections. And there's so many connections to be made. You know, if someone's doing visual fine arts but they're interested in helping people, have they ever thought about art therapy or music therapy? Or, you know, they need us to help them, you know, make those connections. And the faculty are so well versed in the areas that, you know how they can make those connections and what's working for them. So it's often a question of helping them dig deeper within themselves and understand themselves and try to put aside both expectations and those things that they've internalized that they have to do. So I just wanted to say that. The only other comment I was going to make is that we do have a workshop at orientation for parents where we do give them lots of materials about the transition to college for both them and their students and how to support their students. But of course, many parents don't get to that. So it's a great idea to have more of those or to figure out how we can get that communication out to them too.
Other questions, thoughts, ideas?
I just want to, can I just say one thing here that keeps occurring as everyone's talking? I keep going back to grade anxiety, and as you just mentioned, first generation students, it's a 2-year college, and some are young, some are coming back to regroup, whatever their reasons. You know, we have a great mix of different students. But to that point of how we can be so intimidating, and the whole experience can be intimidating, the underlying piece behind it all in the back of their mind is, I'm in college and I'm going to do well and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to make a living and I'm going to better my family and all of these wonderful motivations that everyone has. But underlying it all is this fear and anxiety and upset about the grades. And of course, we have to have a rubric, we have to have assessments, we have to make sure that they're getting the information. But part of that anxiety can, I believe, be dissipated or modulated a little bit with some relaxation on let's just be together and learn this material and enjoy the learning process and get off your own back for just a moment. Yeah, there's time. You can go on to school later on, a 4-year college, you can have a master's degree and a PhD and go conquer the world, do whatever you want, but just take a moment and appreciate where you're at, because it's not just the classroom, it's the community, as Todd mentioned. And if you notice that, you know, in the beginning of the fall semester, the place is just clenched. You know, students are just clenched. And by Thanksgiving break and then towards Christmas, they're talking and they're having a good time and they're getting to know each other and they're just relaxed. So wouldn't it be nice to have that experience in the learning process as well? So I just had to add that.
One thing this is very intimidating. I've never talked to students. I really don't like talking in front of people, which is kind of funny. You know, I guess it's an anxiety issue. But one thing I do on the first day of class, and I've been doing this for probably 20 years, is I hand out a little green piece of paper and I ask the students for 5 pieces of information. I ask for their name, their home phone number, their email, hometown. And then I say, tell me one thing interesting about yourself, or something you'd like me to know. I don't remember how I word it. I find this a great outlet for students to tell me things like, you know, I'm dyslexic. You know, I have 3 children under 2 at home. You know, crazy things like that. And so, you know, my perception is they like this opportunity to be able to provide me with this information without having to come and see me. So that's been a great idea, and I find out some really cool stuff about my students too, things that they've done. So that's just, I figured I would share that.
I do the same thing. I ask them for their strengths and their challenges and what do you want me to know about you. I find it very rewarding.
Yeah, they're fun to look through at the beginning of the semester, and then especially at the end, now that I know them, I'm like, oh, that makes sense, you know? And or we'll have something in common. I was like, oh, I've done that too. So it can provide opportunities for conversations. I also have my students address me by my first name. I know some people agree with that, some don't, but I try to reduce the intimidation factor. So it's actually funny that Dan called me Dr. Wilkentine. I don't think he's ever called me that. But I do appreciate the effort there. I do tell them on the first day, just, Kelly Works, that's my name, I'll reply to that. Please don't call me Mrs. Wilkentine though, because that's my mom, so. I will just respond to that.
And I have similar techniques for the first day. We usually do some sort of group work to get the students talking to each other, and also that way I can interact with each of the groups. But one thing that I have noticed, some students mistake an easygoing, friendly way with a lack of standards. So even though we have high-level homework assignments and class examples, when they get to the first test, they think, oh, she's nice, she's going to be easy on this. And it doesn't work that way. So there's a little bit of a wall some of them hit when they realize nice does not mean low standards.
I'll have to add to that. I definitely agree with that, because I might have, in my earlier statement, might have led some people think that would be the case. I give very comprehensive reviews. And I tell them the worst thing that can happen, and we've all experienced it, is to study your head off and then find that the material you studied for is not the stuff that's on the test. So I just make sure that standards are high, but also the review process is also there so they're prepared. So there's no surprises.
I think, I've always thought that some of the stress and problems around grades isn't just, when students, if they don't get good grades, they start worrying about graduation and getting jobs and things. I think there's also like an aspect of self-esteem that when you struggle or do poorly in school, naturally it makes you feel bad about yourself, right? I always feel like, on one hand, we do want to maintain high standards, and we want to encourage our students to work hard and get good grades, and grades are important. But on the other hand, we also have to try to send a message. Grades aren't that important in some ways, right? We tend to overestimate, I think, in a lot of ways, the importance of schooling. Grades, being an excellent student academically is just a part of you as a person, right? You're not the best academically, but you still have lots of other talents or good things about you. And lots of people succeed even if they don't have the strongest academic backgrounds or wherever they go to school. And I think sometimes we need to do a better job sending that message to our students who struggle that, don't take this too much to heart in some ways. Like, don't get too down over this. If you're doing your best and you're passing, and that's okay. And we have to, I think it's easier for students to get down on themselves and feel bad about themselves for struggling academically. And there's some reality. We have a lot of students here who are not A students and are not going to get A's. And I think we have to, in some ways, try to ease the messages we send to those students who don't, in some ways, so they don't feel like they're failures in some ways because they're not doing well in school. And I don't know exactly how to do that, but I just think maybe that's something to try to be conscious about, right? That, we don't sort of reinforce that pressure by kind of insisting on and expecting, academic excellence from everybody and realizing, for some of our students, that's, they just won't achieve that.
I just wanted to respond to that quickly, and that is the issue of compassionate feedback. I feel like some of the most important moments and choices I have in a semester is how to respond to a student who got a D or an F on an essay. Like that feedback is getting scrutinized, by the student. And how are you going to deliver that? And I think there are ways to do it that are compassionate, but also, you know, letting know what the standards are and why they weren't met. So that's an important dance to do.
So I just also wanted to make the point that for us, or at least in the semester that I teach in nursing, it's often the higher achievers that struggle the most with that self-concept, and because they kind of hit a wall, you know, they're kind of used to excel, and then they get to a place where it's really hard and they're not excelling anymore, and that's where we see them kind of fall off the turnip truck, and things are not going well at home anymore, and things are not going well at school anymore, and they think they're a terrible person, and they think, you know, there's nothing going right anymore. So I almost think that sometimes those are the people I need to keep a closer eye on than the ones that have self-disclosed, like in the first 5 minutes.
Anybody else? Well, I want to thank,
All right, so just piggyback off what you said over here about kind of breaking down the intimidation from professors, and also what you mentioned, Sheila, about allocating more resources. I think those are both very important points, and when we allocate more resources, I think we should do that not towards professionals, but towards student workers. I think if a student has a problem and they need to seek counseling or advising, if they can go and speak to somebody who's their age, who they can kind of connect with, that'll help them actually be able to relate to that person, and it'll be more beneficial, not only for mental health issues, but for giving a lasting impact on the students, which helps our alumni, and also retention rates.
anybody else? Great conversations that we hope to continue after lunch. I want to thank the four of you very much. Thank you. So just 1 minute before we break for lunch, I know Mary Ellen wanted to say hello and check in. And
good morning, everybody. We're going to break for lunch, and then we're also, while you're eating, we're going to do a President's Cabinet update. So we'll try to do two things at once so that you can finish up around 2 o'clock this afternoon. Enjoy.